Foresight is a knowledge or sound judgment into a future event that may or may not occur. And that definition comes from a business dictionary. I like the phrase that may or may not occur. A great example of foresight is seen in the exploration of the South Pole. This is actually one of my favorite stories. I love history, and I especially really enjoy historical information that helps us to learn from both success and failure. So the South Pole was reached for the very first time in 1911. The first person was Scott. He was British, and he began planning for his trip, and he was backed by the British government. And he did his pack mules and he had his men, and everybody thought, oh, he's definitely going to be the very first person to hit the South Pole, because just a few years prior to that, he had actually been on a ship and had surveyed the terrain, and he had a good idea of what it looked like. The other guy was Norwegian, Amundsen, and he also was planning a great trip, and he had dog sleds, and he was excited as well. However, his trip was just a little bit different. Robert Scott, the British explorer, he set off thinking that this was going to be the only party in Antarctica, and so he was pretty excited. He didn't think anybody else was going to be going to the South Pole. He had no clue that somebody else was going to be heading down there at the same time. Now, enter Roald Amundsen, the Norwegian. He actually was planning on going to the North Pole, and he had planned for a great time that he was going to be the first person to ever hit the North Pole. Of course, his entire plan of exploration was dashed to pieces when he discovered that somebody else had already been there just a few months prior, and he set off. Oh, he was so discouraged, but he set off toward the South Pole, and it wasn't until he left that he told his crew and his team that they were actually not going to the North Pole, but to the South Pole. Well, he planned a little bit differently. He had dog sleds, and he had studied from Eskimos and those that lived in a very cold climate. So when he got to the South Pole, he reached it, and he was excited, and he went home in triumph, and he was well received on lecture tours that all talked about his achievement. However, it was very sad a few months later when the news arrived that Robert Scott and his entire party had reached the South Pole as well, but they actually had perished. They had perished because of their lack of foresight. They didn't have the foresight that Amundsen had when he was looking into going there. I would really recommend that you read more about this beautiful historical story so that you can see and compare and contrast the differences between the successful trip and the trip of failure. But how we spend our time really is going to demonstrate our values and the importance that we place on our lives and those that are in our lives. There are so many wonderful lessons learned about the exploration of the Antarctic from both of these explorers, and they're valuable for all future expeditions. Their stories are fascinating for many reasons, and they are revealed as a very complex character, which is affected by a whole host of factors, not just about the world and their countries, but also they were affected as well by the buy-in of their countries, how they had their equipment set up. They had wonderful information. The wonderful thing now is that we have this beautiful scientific station at the South Pole that's manned year-round, and it's called the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station. So I want you to think, as you have read a little bit more, I hope you've taken the time to look a little more into this trip that they had. There's some beautiful, wonderful videos on YouTube if you prefer a more visual representation or learning environment. But there's some wonderful opportunities to learn more about how these two teams prepared differently. And I want you to think about how their preparations differed. And how did those preparations impact the success or the failure of their journeys? So also, as you're looking at how they differed, I want you to also think is how does this experience from history highlight the importance of foresight and preparation? You could never imagine that everything would go wrong. However, foresight is what makes it possible for a successful encounter. Every achievement starts with a goal, but not just any goal. This is written by Robert Greenleaf. Robert Greenleaf is also the author of Servant Leadership. So one day, I want to tell you this story, and this is shared by Robert Greenleaf. I love this. So one day, a traveler is walking down a lane, and he came across these stone cutters, and they're working in a quarry, and each of them was really busy cutting out these big blocks of stone, and he was curious. What are they doing, and what are they working on? And the first stone cutter says, "Oh, I'm just cutting a stone." So the traveler didn't get it. He's like, "Okay, well, you're cutting a stone, but what are you doing, right?" So he turns to the second stone cutter and he says, "I'm cutting this stone a block, and I'm going to make sure it's perfectly square and the dimensions are uniform, and it's going to fit exactly like it should on place in the wall." Well, that was nice, but that really didn't give him a vision of what he was doing. Sure, it's a wall, and it was going to be square and a box, but what does that mean? So he wanted to find out even more. And so he moved on to the third stone cutter, and he seemed to be the happiest of the three. He was singing as he worked and really getting into it. And he's like, "What are you doing?" And the third one says, "I am building a cathedral." This story beautifully illustrates this key leadership quality of having foresight, of seeing this bigger picture. And all three stone cutters, they were doing the same thing, exactly the same thing. But what made the difference? They each gave a very different answer, didn't they? Basically, when I look at this, I just think, wow, one really provided a great vision, didn't he? So I really want you to take a moment that knowing not just how and what to do, but knowing why, viewing the whole and not just its parts, but seeing a vision gives us a sense of that really larger picture, and it has the ability and the significance and work beyond the obvious. So I want you to really think about this. What was it that set that third stone cutter apart? Also, how did his vision impact his emotions and his attitude? So Viktor Frankl wrote a wonderful book talking about meaning and having meaning in one's life. It's one of my favorite books. And he was a Holocaust survivor, and he developed psychotherapeutic method. It was called logotherapy. So think about this, logo meaning words. So this therapy is based on the belief that a human nature is motivated through a purpose or having a purpose in one's life. So when you look at this, think about this. How did having a goal make a difference for Viktor Frankl in the concentration camps? And if you don't really know him or his history, I'd really suggest that you look a little bit into it, because he's a phenomenal character who gives some great insights in how to survive the greatest struggles in the world. So when you have that foresight, it gives you a personal direction to guide daily activities, without which we will accomplish little toward our own goals.